Why do rational people making rational decisions keep producing terrible outcomes? When it comes to the federal budget, we tend to say that the system is broken. Deadlines loom, negotiations stall, the government shuts down. Each side insists it's acting responsibly. Each side claims the moral high ground. But here's the catch. Congress isn't broken. It's behaving exactly the way its incentive structure encourages it to behave. What we're watching isn't collapse, it's adaptation. Under regular order, Congress is supposed to pass 12 separate appropriations bills before the fiscal year begins on October 1st. These are 12 subject matter bills, not 12 months. Each must pass the House, the Senate, and then be signed by the President. The last time Congress completed that process on time was in 1996 for the fiscal year 1997. Since then, regular order has largely collapsed. Congress has relied on continuing resolutions or CRs. These are temporary funding extensions that keep the government open while negotiations drag on. It's a system adapting to repeated failure and strategy. But why strategy? Because federal budget negotiations aren't one-off deals. They repeat. From a game theorist's perspective, that makes them an iterated, non-cooperative game. As we learned in our previous episode on game theory, a one-off non-cooperative game is stable when both sides defect. But with budget negotiations, we're dealing with a repeat game. Why? In a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, defection is the rational strategy. But when the same players meet again and again, the logic of the game changes. In 1979, political scientist Robert Axelrod asked a simple question. Do repeated games behave like one-off games where both sides end up defecting? So he ran an experiment, a computer tournament of strategies. Each strategy would face off with every other strategy. The goal: score as many points as possible. The first tournament was 200 rounds, repeated 5 times to ensure that the results were not merely a fluke. The scoring system was simple. If both cooperated, each earned 3 points. If both defected, each earned 1 point. If one defected while the other cooperated, the defector earned 5 points and the cooperator earned nothing. Each program with its own strategy would face off with every other strategy. 14 strategies were submitted, including one Axelrod added later called random, which randomly cooperates or defects. Some were incredibly complicated. Their designers tried to game the system. They assumed unpredictability might give them an edge. Be nice one moment, betray the next. Outsmart their opponent, exploit the pattern. Others were brutally harsh. A nice strategy, Grim Trigger, which Axelrod called Friedman for its author James W. Friedman, turned out to not do as well as any of the other nice strategies. It cooperates once, but if the opponent defects even a single time, it defects forever. No forgiveness, no second chances. It sounds tough? It is. But in repeated games, toughness turned out to be a disadvantage. Because once cooperation collapses, both sides keep earning lower scores. So what kind of strategy actually won the tournament? Not the most clever, not the most aggressive, the simplest one. Tit for tat. It had just 4 lines of code. Start by cooperating, then simply do whatever the other player did in the previous round. Tit for tat's win revealed 2 important traits of successful strategies. Be nice. The opposite of nice is nasty. A strategy that defects first is nasty. The other one was to be forgiving. If the opponent returns to cooperation, forgive. When Tit for tat played against Joss, they began by cooperating, but on the 6th move, Joss defected, which spurred back and forth defections, which dragged both players' scores down. Although Tit for tat performed worse against Joss in that matchup, overall in the first tournament, Tit for tat finished first with the highest overall score, averaging 504 points. The theoretical maximum was 600. Of the contestants in the tournament, 8 were nice. They began by cooperating, 7 were nasty, they defected first. Nice strategies consistently outperformed nasty ones. Tit for tat didn't win by crushing its opponents. It won by cooperating whenever cooperation was possible. After the first tournament, Axelrod later wrote another strategy called sample, which was even more forgiving than tit for tat. It only retaliated after 2 defections. You might call it tit for 2 tats. Had anyone submitted sample, it likely would have won the first contest. But the deeper lesson of tit for tat was something else. Tit for tat worked because the players expected to meet again. In other words, the future mattered. And Axelrod's most important discovery may have been this. Tit for tat didn't win by defeating its opponents. It won by encouraging cooperation. But there is a catch. Axelrod realized that a predictable number of rounds meant that if one knows when the last round is, there is no reason to cooperate in the last round, as though they are playing a single round of prisoner's dilemma. Both sides should logically defect. And if both know they should defect, then they should defect in the round before, and then the one before that, and go back to the beginning. So Axelrod made the second tournament with an unknown number of rounds, approximating 200, but not exactly. For this tournament, he received 62 entries and he added random. Again, there were 2 types of entries, nice and nasty. In the top 15, only 1 entry was nasty. In the bottom 15, only 1 was nice. Most of the nasty strategies didn't just lose, they destroyed each other. And yet one result stood out. When tit for tat played against Grim Trigger, both earned perfect scores, and they never broke cooperation, not once. Something didn't add up. Grim Trigger was perfect against tit for tat, but it didn't perform nearly as well against the full field. This wasn't just a ranking anymore. It was beginning to look like something else. Not just strategies, but an ecosystem. Axelrod turned to biology for insight. In The Evolution of Cooperation, he drew on Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, where similar patterns had already been described. Evolutionary biology, Axelrod wrote, provides a useful way to think about this dynamic problem. With that insight, Axelrod took the next step. He turned his tournament into a Darwinian process. Strategies that performed well would grow in number. Poor performers would fade away. The better a strategy did, the more it spread through the population. As he explained, we simply have to interpret the average payoff received by an individual as proportional to the individual's expected number of offspring. What if each strategy behaved less like a program and more like a species? Feeding, reproducing, expanding, or disappearing? One of the most interesting was Harrington. Harrington wasn't nice. It was strategic, built to recognize, adapt, and exploit. It didn't defect randomly, but it did escalate. Each breakdown in cooperation led to longer and longer punishments, making its behavior harder to predict and harder to recover from. Harrington's strategy, which ranked 8th in the original tournament, initially expanded its lead, but its success depended on exploiting nastier strategies. But as those nastier strategies began to disappear, Harrington lost the environment it depended on. Its population collapsed. Axelrod was showing something deeper than a single tournament result. He was showing that in an evolving population of strategies, cooperation could spread and even dominate. In this ecosystem, tit for tat came out on top. It didn't win by crushing its opponents. It won by making cooperation possible. And for Axelrod, that was the deeper discovery. Even in a world of self-interest, cooperation doesn't just appear, it emerges, survives, and even thrives. After the second tournament, Axelrod discovered 2 more successful strategies. One was to be retaliatory. That is, if betrayed, one should defect immediately. And the other one is to be clear. Don't be random. The reason for being clear is so important that, in essence, a random strategy behaves as a one-off game, so an opponent should defect. Based on these tournaments, in all, Axelrod eventually identified 4 qualities of successful strategies: nice, forgiving, retaliatory, and clear. In an eerie sense, Axelrod's conclusions get pretty close to biblical or Mosaic law. Be good, but an eye for an eye. What's so remarkable about this result is not only did tit for tat win again, but according to Axelrod in his book, A Passion for Cooperation, it never once did any better than any of the wide range of strategies it interacted with. Axelrod continues, in fact, I came to realize it couldn't do better than the player it was interacting with. The reason is that to do better than the player you are interacting with, you have to defect more than the other side does. And tit for tat never does that. It starts with cooperation and never defects unless the other player has just defected. So it can't defect more times than the other player and therefore can't do better than the other player. But it won both rounds of the tournament, outperforming every other strategy. Tit for tat was effective because it elicited more cooperation from other players than any other strategy. Or, as one reviewer said, nice guys finish first. This can't happen in a zero-sum game like chess or football, but it can and did happen in the Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma. Okay, so this is a remarkable discovery, but it raises a deeper question. Could this kind of cooperation in a computer simulation emerge even between enemies in real life? In The Evolution of Cooperation, Robert Axelrod explores that question. Axelrod recounted how in war cooperation could emerge despite great antagonism between opponents, even when they hate each other. He leaned on the research of Tony Ashworth from his book Trench Warfare, 1914 to 1918. World War I was one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. Perhaps Ashworth surmised because soldiers expected to fight again the next day, they cooperated. Along stretches of the Western Front, British and German soldiers faced each other day after day, month after month, the same opponent again and again. In theory, each side was supposed to attack whenever possible, but in many sectors, something unexpected happened. A pattern emerged. Soldiers called it live and let live. Instead of constantly attacking, both sides quietly limited the violence. Artillery would fire, often deliberately short or long. Machine guns rattled, but aimed over trenches. At night, repair parties worked in open and neither side fired. Each side understood the pattern. They understood break it and retaliation would follow, but respect it and both sides survived. Repeated interaction made cooperation possible. And that's exactly the pattern Axelrod saw in his computer tournament for the repeated games. The soldiers in the trenches had never heard of game theory, but they had discovered the same logic Axelrod's tournament revealed. So when does cooperation break down? In February, President Trump attacked Iran. He said he did so to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. This was not simply a military action, it was politics through force. As Karl von Clausewitz put it, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And as Thomas Schelling later observed, coercion works not through destruction alone, but through the threat of what comes next. War moves at the pace of diplomacy, so when Trump struck Tehran, the expectation was clear: apply pressure and compel a concession. But in a repeated game, the opponent gets to move too, and the opponent doesn't have to respond on your terms. The outcome depends on both sides, so it's no longer one party's decision. And the Iran conflict moved from nuclear weapons to the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage through which a significant share of the world's oil flows. And once that became the leverage, the game changed. So what began as a contained move became something else, a system-wide shock. As Schelling wrote, war and the brink of war are more a contest of nerve and risk-taking, of pain and endurance. Small wars embody the threat of a larger war, and they are not just military engagements, but crisis diplomacy. Each side gets to make a decision, how much risk to create and how much pain to endure, and no one controls the outcome. Each side only chooses the next move. And as we saw in Axelrod's tournaments, once defection begins, cooperation can unravel very quickly. And that may be the deeper lesson. We can't control the outcome, we can't control the system, but we can act within it. And that's game theory in politics. and I'll see you in the next video.